What happens when your last name is a curse? When the blood in your veins ties you to some of history's darkest crimes? This isn't a story about generals, dictators, or SS officers. It's about their children, sons and daughters born into privilege under the Nazi regime, and what became of them when the Third Reich fell in flames. Some disappeared into new identities, seeking to leave behind the burden of their family names. Others were raised with a kind of fierce loyalty that wouldn't denounce the fathers who started concentration camps or ordered mass murder. Some felt the guilt so intensely, they swore they would never have children of their own, refusing to perpetuate a bloodline. But what is more haunting, the ones who rejected their past, or those who tried to defend it? In this episode, we learn the chilling fates of the unspoken children of men such as Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and Hermann Göring. Their tales of shame, silence, and survival show how the sins of one generation can damn the next. And believe us, some of these endings you won't see coming. Let's discuss it in today's episode of Light's History. By 1945, when the Third Reich collapsed, its leaders were dead, captured, or being hunted. A world demanded justice for the horrors of the Holocaust and the ruins of war. Himmler, Goebbels, Göring, all these names came to be associated with cruelty, fanaticism, and mass murder. But while history concentrated on their crimes, few ever paused to ask, what became of their children? For these sons and daughters, the collapse of Nazi Germany represented more than just the defeat of a nation or an idea. It meant a legacy of blood, guilt, and infamy. Their surnames were not merely labels, they were life sentences. Gudrun Himmler was the daughter of SS leader Heinrich Himmler and one of only two immediate family members to survive the war. Gudrun adored her father. In family photographs, she holds on to him at Berghof retreats and public parades. As the Allies approached Germany, Gudrun believed in the righteousness of his cause. Himmler would commit suicide in British custody in May 1945, and it shattered her world, but it did not break her loyalty. After the war, Gudrun was interrogated, placed in internment camps, and later released. As an adult, she became one of the most unapologetic defenders of her father's memory. She joined neo-Nazi circles, worked to support former SS officers, and spent decades insisting Heinrich Himmler had been a good, honorable man. Until her death in 2018, Gudrun never expressed public remorse. Then there was Etta Göring, daughter of Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor. Etta, Hitler's favorite child of the Nazi elite, was frequently lavished with gifts and attention at Obersalzberg. She was only 7 when the Reich collapsed. Etta had grown up under a cloud of infamy after her father committed suicide while awaiting execution at Nuremberg. Etta took a different and more peaceful route than Gudrun. For most of her life, she declined to comment publicly about her father's crimes. In her only televised interview, she spoke of Hermann Göring as a loving, kind man, avoiding any mention of his role in the regime's atrocities. She never married, never bore any children, and lived in relative obscurity until her death in 2018. The children of Goebbels faced the worst destiny. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, and his wife Magda were fanatically devoted to the regime. In the last days of the war, with Soviet forces closing in on Berlin, Magda made an awful decision. She killed her 6 children, the youngest being 4, the oldest 12, with poison in the Führer bunker before she and Joseph killed themselves on May 1, 1945. In a last letter to her eldest son from her first marriage, Harold Quandt, Magda wrote that she could not bear to live the world without National Socialism. The Luftwaffe officer Harold was the only Goebbels child to survive the war. Later, he became a wealthy industrialist in post-war Germany, inheriting a share of the Quandt family fortune. He seldom talked about his mother or his stepfather, though his descendants suffered from the public spotlight when documentaries revealed that the Quandt industrial empire had made money from forced labor during the Nazi days. The trauma extended beyond Germany. In post-war Austria, France, and beyond, Nazi offspring often found themselves shunned, taunted, or quietly discounted. Teachers would not speak their names in classrooms. Neighbors whispered. Church communities argued over whether they should be baptized. Their fathers' sins haunted them everywhere. Many crumbled under the mental weight of guilt and infamy. A handful took their own lives in the subsequent decades. Others pledged never to have children, vowed to break a bloodline tainted by history. One survivor remarked decades later, "You don't get to choose your family, but you spend a lifetime deciding whether to live with it or against it." The fates of these children, the disappeared, the insurgent, and the willing, comprise one of history's most unsettling inheritances. In the ruins of a fallen empire, they inherited names that no one wanted, and lives haunted by atrocities they didn't commit but could never escape. And their reckoning was only just beginning. Before we move on to the next section, please don't forget to subscribe if you liked the video so far. The final days of the Third Reich in May 1945 not only signaled the end of an era, but the ruin of whole families that depended on that era's rule. As male Nazi architects faced military tribunals, execution, or suicide, their children were forced to navigate a world that wanted to put the past behind it, but wasn't willing to forget it. For a lot of these kids, the immediate aftermath was a mess. Families of leading Nazi officials were arrested as part of the Allied occupation, put in internment camps, or sent to trial before denazification tribunals. Young boys and girls, a few not yet teenagers, were questioned about the whereabouts of their parents, their crimes, and which side they backed. Gudrun Himmler, who was only 16 when the war ended, was detained with her mother Margaret in Italy. By British intelligence, Gudrun was held to be a dangerous fanatic. In subsequent interviews, she described the trauma of being interrogated, placed behind bars in a string of internment camps, and informed over and over again that her father was a killer. But instead of drawing away from him, Gudrun grew more devoted to his memory. Released, she went on to visit former SS officers in prison, signed up for neo-Nazi organizations, and eventually headed a group that worked to help war criminals who had been convicted. Etta Göring, then 7 years old, experienced a different kind of exile. Tucked out of the way in a Munich boarding school as the Allies advanced, Etta was sheltered by family connections within the surviving German elites. Not subjected to the indignities of internment camps, she lived under the shadow of a name Germany wanted desperately to bury. As an adult, Etta has refused to publicly discuss her father's war record. Only once in a carefully controlled 1986 interview did she describe Göring as a warm, wonderful man. She died in 2018, having never publicly condemned or acknowledged the atrocities he orchestrated. Elsewhere, some of the other children of Nazi leaders made far different decisions. Nicholas Frank was raised in the grip of guilt and disgust. The son of Hans Frank, the Governor-General of Nazi-occupied Poland and one of the Holocaust's most notorious perpetrators, Frank loathed and despised his father. Hans Frank was put to death at Nuremberg, but Nicholas bore his name until the end was virtually in sight. Nicholas, as an adult, became one of the most outspoken critics of his family's legacy. His 1987 memoir, In the Shadow of the Reich, is among the most savage, unvarnished works of history published by a Nazi offspring. In it, he referred to his father as a mass murderer, a slime, and a coward. Nicholas spent his life speaking and writing about the threats posed by unbridled ideologies, offering a rare note of public repentance in a world that most often prefers to remain silent. Germany in the post-war years was a brutal place for children of high-ranking Nazis. In a community in desperate need of reconstruction, no one wanted reminders of the past. They were turned away by a lot of schools. Neighbors ostracized them. Others were not allowed in church services or public gatherings. Some changed their names and moved to other cities or left the country altogether. Some, like Rolf Mengele, the son of Auschwitz's notorious Angel of Death, Josef Mengele, spent years denying the rumors about their parentage. Rolf was raised on whispered tales of his father's crimes, but it was only in adulthood that he would feel certain of the truth. In a tense emotional meeting in 1977, Rolf confronted Josef Mengele in hiding in Brazil. The meeting, later recounted in interviews, revealed a father still unrepentant and a son unwilling to condone or defend his actions. Rolf returned to Germany and lived quietly, declining all requests for further comment. Not all descendants felt shame. Some clung stubbornly to the myth of a misunderstood Germany. There had been no one more notorious than Heinrich Himmler, but others, including Wolf Rüdiger Hess, the son of Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, spent decades claiming their fathers had been victims of Allied vengeance. Wolf Rüdiger also claimed that his father tried to negotiate peace with Britain, and that had been wrongly incarcerated at Spandau. He died in 2001, defending Rudolf Hess's honor to the end. What makes these stories so disturbing isn't only the diversity of responses, guilt, denial, silence, or stubborn loyalty, but how those responses echoed through generations. Some children, horrified by their parents' crimes, vowed never to marry or have children of their own. Some changed their last names, cut ties, and attempted to disappear in obscurity. Some bore their legacies like shields, defiantly saving family archives and personal mementos of the Nazi era. Many of these family histories weren't addressed until the 1970s and 1980s, when a new generation of Germans began to demand a reckoning. Television documentaries, academic researchers, and news exposés brought the awkward fact into the open. The architects of genocide had left behind children, many of whom still lived among ordinary citizens. A few chose to speak. Nicholas Frank gave interviews. Rolf Mengele has shared publicly his fateful encounter with his father. Bettina Göring, grandniece of Hermann Göring, described how both she and her brother underwent voluntary sterilization so that, as she put it, the Göring bloodline would die with them. "We didn't want to pass on that blood," she said. "The thought that someone with our name might exist in the world was unbearable." These personal reckonings show how the weight of a name can live on well past courtrooms and history books. The weight didn't lift with their fathers' deaths. It would shadow them through schoolyards and job interviews, marriages and old age. The story of the children of Nazi leaders is one of complicated inheritances, of people who were born into horror without consent, who then spent their lives deciding whether to cling to or break from the legacies that history had given them. And for many, as the years passed, one question remained. Is it possible to outrun a name like Goebbels, Himmler, or Mengele? Or does the past find you, no matter how far you run? Want to understand the world better? Start with history and subscribe to our channel. Over the decades, children of some of Nazi Germany's most powerful leaders grew up in the country that was eager to bury its past. But history doesn't just vanish because the war is over. It stays in names, in rumors, in the unspoken stories carried by those left behind. For many of these sons and daughters, however, adulthood offered no peace and no escape. They were suspended between two worlds, one that could not forgive their father's crimes and another that preferred to pretend none of it had ever happened. In post-war Germany, the culture of silence surrounding the Nazi period dominated public life. Schools skimmed over the war years. Families avoided questions. Neighbors knew what had happened but said nothing. And in this environment, the children of men like Goebbels, Himmler, and Göring were free to figure out for themselves how to live under the unbearable weight of their surnames. Others, such as Nicholas Frank, opted for forthright confrontation. He spent years researching the Holocaust and his father's involvement in it. In interviews, Nicholas talked about a one-sided need to grasp how his father, Hans Frank, could oversee the mass murder of millions, while claiming to be a cultured, God-fearing man. His memoir and public talks pulled no punches. "I despised him," Nicholas said bluntly in one interview. "He was a coward and a killer, and I would never forgive him." But Nicholas was an exception. Most descendants chose silence. Etta Göring never discussed her father's activities, and she disappeared into a tightly controlled privacy. Even when journalists and historians came to her, she was unwilling to engage. Not until 1986 did she give a single televised interview, a vague, loving portrait of her father that neatly bypassed the atrocities linked with his name. Gudrun Himmler also refused any public reckoning. Fiercely devoted, she spent much of her life working to rehabilitate the image of former SS officers, calling for clemency and social support for war criminals. she never stopped to think of why she had such high regard for her father, Heinrich Himmler. Among neo-Nazi sympathizers and far-right circles in private gatherings, Gudrun was treated like royalty, the last connection to the inner circle of the Third Reich. The offspring of other leaders lived equally divided lives. Some moved overseas, changing their names and trying to forge anonymous lives in places like Argentina, Brazil, or Canada. Others stayed in Germany and chose to vanish into civilian life in commonplace jobs, shopkeeper, engineer, teacher, rarely if ever convicted of any atrocity, and hoping that in a rejuvenated democratic country, no one would associate them with the misdeeds of the past. But even those who succeeded in shedding their old identities couldn't fully escape. In post-war towns and cities, people remembered. Gossip followed them. Some faced quiet boycotts from employers or were shunned in schoolyards. Church leaders debated whether to baptize or marry them. And while the state no longer pursued them, public opinion could be merciless. This haunted sense of inherited guilt and shame was not confined to Germany. In post-war Europe, the children of fascist collaborators, SS officers, and Nazi administrators have encountered similar reckonings. Others sought redemption by devoting their lives to human rights work, Holocaust education, or anti-fascist activism. Others retreated from the world, opting for lives of quiet obscurity. New challenges came along with new time. In the 1970s and 1980s, a surge of documentaries, memoirs, and scholarly inquiries opened old wounds. German television interviewed survivors and perpetrators. Universities hosted public debates on collective guilt and family obligation. And once again, the names Goebbels, Himmler, Mengele, and Hess surfaced in headlines, this time not for their crimes, but for the surviving children grappling with the aftermath. For most, the tactic was silent perseverance. They lived behind unmarked doors in a German suburb, held ordinary jobs, and struggled to bring up children without ever mentioning their names in public. Their father's shadow loomed over each birthday, wedding, and family gathering. But history has a way of coming back. In recent decades, researchers and reporters have met long-lost descendants who handed over letters, photographs, even the insidious shadows of secret family archives. These findings often flatly contradicted the official family narratives of innocence and ignorance, revealing complicity, fanaticism, and, in some cases, stubborn nostalgia for a fallen Reich. Today, many of these family lines have disappeared. Some never had children. Others slipped away without any fuss or public notice. And yet, the questions persist. What do we owe to history? Can guilt be inherited? To what extent can children be held responsible for the crimes of their parents? For Germany, the reckoning continues. The stories of these descendants are still examined in universities and discussed in ethics classes. They're also reminders that even decades after a regime falls, the damage it inflicts on families, identities, and memory remains. And perhaps most haunting of all is this: some of those children never renounced their names. They carried them like ghosts. The collapse of Nazi Germany not only left ruins on battlefields, it left scars on families, on names, on futures. There was no easy way out for the children of Third Reich functionaries. Some kept the shadows of their fathers in silence. Others tried to outrun them. A few embraced them. Their stories are a reminder that while history punishes the guilty, it rarely spares the innocent connected by blood. And that raises a question we rarely ask. How much do a parent's sins belong to the child? Some burdens aren't chosen, they're inherited. And sometimes the weight of a name can shape an entire life before it even begins, dictating who you trust, where you live, and how the world sees you. Because in history's long memory, some names don't fade, they echo. If your name was Goebbels, Himmler, Mengele, would you alter it? Would you hide? Would you speak out? Or would you wear it as a sort of defiance? Tell us what you think in the comments. Here's another video history buffs enjoyed watching. Bye for now.